I think those expectations have to be quite moderate, because this is not a situation like the Egypt situation or the Bahrain situation, where the United States had a history of very close relations with President Mubarak or with the King and Crown Prince of Bahrain, where we were in effect military and political partners. We have had a difficult relationship with Colonel Gaddafi since he assumed power in 1969. We've had periods of diplomatic isolation, of no diplomatic relations. We had the brutal and cynical shoot down of Pan Am 103 ordered by the Libyan government, where he ordered the murder of American citizens. So we don't have the history with him to have the kind of influence that we practiced in both Bahrain and in Egypt. And it may be that if this situation persists, where the Libyan government continues to use brutal force against its own people, it may be that you're going to see calls of a type that you heard from members of Congress today, that perhaps the United States should reimpose economic sanctions on Libya in order to try to exert some influence on this very violent Gaddafi regime.
But in the end, though, do those calling for more robust action have to bear in mind that the U.S. simply can't put morality ahead of its strategic interests?
Well, I don't think it's a question of that. I think the U.S. has clearly signaled in the statements of Secretary Clinton today, of President Obama, that the U.S. is unalterably opposed to what the Gaddafi regime is doing to try to cling to power by shooting people in the streets of Benghazi and Tripoli. The U.S. does not support that. I don't
but
think
he's using U.S. weapons
to hedge its bets at all.
Yes,
Pardon?
But he's using U.S. weapons, and we've heard these statements in Egypt and Tunisia and so forth. I mean, I suppose it has to be remembered. I suppose the point was that under your administration, actually in the Bush administration, that was when relations were normalized, again, through realpolitik. But he was still, quote, a mad dog, but he was our mad dog. So, I mean, again, it's all about realpolitik, though, isn't it? How can things change? Or are you calling perhaps, I mean, can there ever be a real shift from that?
Well, I think I wouldn't agree with the way you've characterized it. I think that the United States has never had a close relationship with Gaddafi. We normalized relations back in 2003 and 2004 for a number of reasons, one of which was that he agreed to give up ambitions for weapons of mass destruction and agreed to submit to international inspection. That was quite a considerable achievement, I think, for the international community, for the United States and Britain, who were involved in that. But I think the U.S. has gone out of its way to disassociate itself from Gaddafi, especially over the last couple of days, and it's the right decision, I think, by the United States government. The difficulty is if the world is expecting that the U.S. can exert influence on Colonel Gaddafi, it's not a situation that's analogous to some of the others that we've seen over the last couple of weeks in the Arab world.
Right, but I mean, with respect, though, in return for Colonel Gaddafi renouncing that weapons program, it was the U.S. who re-legitimized him in the international arena and allowed him to solidify his control over his country, and despite lovely words about freedom agendas and so forth. Isn't that just the way U.S. policy will always have to work, unless there ever will be some enormous break with policy?
You know, you've seen an American administration, beginning with the Egypt crisis on January 28th, when President Obama made his first significant statement. That administration just swung its weight behind the reformers in Egypt. That administration used its influence to convince President Mubarak to leave power. The Obama administration used its influence to convince the Bahraini government to stop the use of force against its citizens in Pearl Square. And now that administration is one of the loudest voices in condemning what's happening in Tripoli. So I think the characterization would be unfair that somehow the U.S. has been playing both sides of it. I don't see that at all.
Ambassador, with respect, certainly what we're hearing from those in the countries that you're talking about is a picture of a U.S. administration that does hedge its bets until it's clear who is going to win, and then it switches sides. And that's what's...
I think that's a grossly unfair statement, and any objective viewer of the situation in Egypt and Bahrain over the last couple of weeks would understand that what was remarkable about this, that is, after several decades of hedging its bets, several decades of trying to achieve multiple ambitions in its relations with these countries, the Obama administration did swing its support behind the reformers. There's no question about that.
Is there still a dichotomy between a country being stable, or does a choice have to be made between stability and human rights, or has that model now been broken? Because again, if that model has been broken, we're not seeing the sort of forceful break with past U.S. foreign policy you might expect?
Well, I think what you're seeing is responsible. The Obama administration clearly pushing for reform in places like Bahrain and Egypt, but hoping for stability, because we all hope for stability. No one wants to see these countries become unstable places. We want to see investment. You want to see the people retain their jobs. We want to see economic growth. Libya is different, because despite the considerable Western economic interests in the energy situation there, the behavior of the Gaddafi regime over the last several days is so objectionable. I think you're seeing a very sharp and unprecedented reaction against that regime.
So it's possible then to support dictators...
In the statements of the U.S. over the last couple of days.
It's possible to support dictators as long as their actions don't overtly offend. So that's why you can still support other key business partners, but Libya might be close. I mean, is that the difference then? Is when we start seeing atrocities that perhaps the U.S. has to reconsider its relationship with some of these client regimes and dictatorships?
I guess I don't see the U.S. acting quite very differently than many other countries around the world, or any of the other countries around the world. What was different over the last couple of weeks is that the Obama administration went beyond what most countries are willing to do in siding with reform and pushing established governments towards reform. I think Libya is very different, and you're going to see a different type of international reaction because the Gaddafi government appears not to be listening to the United Nations Security Council, not to be listening to Europe, and not to be listening to the rest of the Arab world or the U.S. It's an isolated regime. It's a regime run by one family, which appears not to have the support of many people at all in its own countries. You have the defection of Libyan diplomats at the United Nations now speaking against the regime. So I guess I wouldn't compare these two situations, the situation of Egypt and Libya, closely. I think the sociology and the history is quite different here.
So then, very quickly, finally, then, what would you advise the U.S. government to do right now?
I think what they're doing, be very clear in condemning the human rights abuses by the Gaddafi government and being willing to go back to economic sanctions should the international community have to do that to get the attention of Colonel Gaddafi and his family.
Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's one view from the United States. Let's return to Doreen in Doha.
All right, Shihab, well, the view from here is that the Arab League has blocked Libya from taking part in the group's meetings. The decision comes after the organization held an emergency meeting in Cairo to discuss the Libyan uprising. The League's Secretary General Amr Moussa has already expressed his deep concern over the deadly crackdown on protesters, but the League stopped short of suspending Libya from the organization. Shireen Tadros sent this report from the Egyptian capital, Cairo.
Well, after a 3-hour meeting, the Arab League issued a statement that's been seen as neither strong in words or action. The Arab League called on the Libyan regime to stop their actions against the Libyan people. They condemned the use of violence, and they've called on the Libyan regime to lift the ban on the media and to allow for the free passage of medical aid. Perhaps the most important part of that statement came when the Secretary General Amr Moussa said that the Libyan delegation from here on in would not be allowed to participate